Hi, welcome to the Tomorrow's Table. I'm your host Hitesh Saklani, and in Tomorrow's Table, we are very fascinating about how the policies are made and what challenges come behind them. And in today's show, we have very special guest, Mr. Carpentier. He's the convener of the Editorial Board of the World Affairs Journal, and he's also the author of the books From India to Infinity and A Shining City on the Hill and Memories of the 101 Moon. Welcome, sir.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
So, sir, when I purchased this book From India to Infinity, I was very curious about this cover page. So, can you tell us the story behind?
That in itself requires a long explanation, which will get us right to the heart of some of the things I do. Because on the one hand, I have been a student for many years of esoteric Hindu and Buddhist philosophy and symbology. And as you know, at the heart of what I would call the Dharmic symbology, which includes Buddhism, Jainism, as well as their parent Hinduism in its many forms, we have the mandala and the yantra. So these forms are symbolic, they are geometric, and they emanate from a center and radiate outwards. So there's a very old symbol which has a cosmological significance, but it also happens that in the last 40, 50 years, as most people will know if they just either look at some of the newspapers or go on the web and they type crop circles, you will find that hundreds of those very, very precisely geometrically formed crop circles have appeared, particularly in England, but not only, and in a particular region of England, and they are formed according to a process for which we have no current technological capability, in the sense that these crop circles are formed in a few seconds, generally at night, but they are formed by certain moving lights, you might call them plasma balls, that float down or fly down and go very quickly over a particular field. The surface can be as wide as, 500 feet by 500 feet or even larger. And within a few seconds, you will see these very complex patterns appearing. None of the wheat or any other grain, cereal, which is grown in that particular place, is cut or destroyed. They just bend many of the stems and weave them as if it were a basket work. And that appears in a matter of seconds, at most a minute or two. And it's done with great perfection without any contact. It's all electromagnetic energy. So this is what forms well-known crop circles. I don't have to say more because there is so much information on the net that anybody who wants to know will find out. And it would take me hours to go further into all the research that has been done about crop circles. Well, these crop circles have not been explained in terms of human action. They come from most probably non-human interventions. And they are in some way connected to all the great geometric circles and patterns that we are familiar with, including the mandalas and yantras. So there is a clear connection between the present, which is obviously technological, because crop circles are the product of a very advanced technology, and it also sends us back to the ancient knowledge of India, but also other parts of the world.
When we talk about Indian civilization is one of the oldest civilization currently we have in the world, like Chinese and all other things. So there was a mathematician, Safre. He wrote in his Zero, the biography of the dangerous idea. Indians never had a fear of the infinite or the void. So can you tell us a little about this thing?
As you know, zero appears in India, although other civilizations, such as the Mayans of Central America, knew the zero. And it seems like other civilizations knew it too, but they may not have utilized it as the Indians did, because the Indian use of the zero in mathematics was eventually borrowed by other cultures in the Middle East and then in Europe. And it transformed mathematics. In fact, it allowed mathematics to become an all-encompassing subject or discipline or science. Because without the zero, mathematics is extremely limited. As you probably know, the Romans did not really have the zero at the heyday of their empire. They still hadn't understood it, and therefore they didn't use it, and that limited considerably their ability to expand into large numbers. That's why the Greeks and the Romans never went beyond 10,000, whereas already in the Vedas, and then in the Shulbashastras and other later works, the Indians were counting in trillions and quadrillions, quintillions. And there are names in Sanskrit, Yajurveda, for all those very, very large numbers, which we now use in terms of astrophysics and in terms of advanced mathematics, but which we had no use for until a couple of centuries ago, because we didn't know what a quintillion meant. We never went beyond a few million, basically. So, by the way, this reflects itself in the state of our economy, because when you think that 200 years ago, people could hardly think of more than 10 million, it was considered the largest fortune that anybody could ever have. And now the richest people are counting in hundreds of billions. So that shows, on the one hand, the devaluation of the currency, but also it shows our growing familiarity with very, very large numbers. We are now coming to a point where not only a company can be $1 trillion company, but even an individual like Elon Musk might be worth $1 trillion in the next 2-3 years. So whatever that means. So what I'm driving at here is that the zero was a fundamental tool for the progress of human awareness of reality. And India obviously played a seminal role in that. What's very interesting, however, if you look at the way in which the zero was used in India, you can find that they had, right from the early Middle Ages, few centuries after Christ, they had understood how to use the zero in additions, subtractions, and multiplications. But the zero was not understood as we understood it in the West, because somehow the West never quite understood the zero. Why? Because zero is nothing, so nothing is nothing, and there is nothing to be said about it. But what Indians had understood, probably starting from their philosophical and metaphysical analysis and also contemplation, is that the zero is not nothing. In fact, the zero is everything, because it encompasses all other things. It's unmanifest, avyakta. And therefore, if you, for example, multiply a number by zero, the West tell you, well, any number multiplied by zero, according to Western mathematics, is zero. But the Indian ancient mathematics does not say that. It leaves an ambiguity about it. Why? Because the zero is not nothing. Therefore, if you multiply by zero, of course, if you subtract zero from anything, the number remains the same. If you add zero to any number, the number remains the same. But if you multiply zero by a number, or rather the other way around, if you multiply a number by zero, then what happens? Then that's something which is a philosophical issue, And of course, you'll say, well, a philosophy has no meaning outside mathematics, because philosophy is just a game of ideas, whereas mathematics is a precise factual discipline. But that's not entirely true, because if you look, for example, at various notions of space and time and at notions of motion, you realize that even though mathematics may give you an answer, later on, an analysis of reality through physics gives you a different answer. And I won't go into that in great length, but if you look, for example, at what Zeno of Elea in Greece said about facts, about all things. He said that actually nothing moves, because if you freeze anything, it's unmoving. In the sense that if you freeze time, it doesn't move. But then it means, how then can it move? It means there is a series of unmoving moments, and the continuity of unmoving moments doesn't produce movement. Therefore, he ended up saying there is no such thing as movement. And of course, people said he's an idiot, because obviously things move. We can see them moving. But then if you look at physics today, it tells you that actually things don't move. It's our consciousness that moves. And of course, I won't go into that, but it's quantum physics, which means that reality does not always meet our logics. There is a difference. And in a way, sometimes reality is counterintuitive.
So in your book, I think in chapter 4, you mentioned about the lost kingdom, Agartha. So can you tell us a little bit about this lost kingdom, Agartha?
So-called symbolic geography is very deep-rooted in many parts of the world. You are always talking about, ancient civilizations are always talking about hidden realities and hidden realms or empires. And that obviously has a symbolic side. You know, if you take the literary scholarly interpretation of today, they tell you this is just imagination, and it may have been based on some old kingdom which was somewhere in the Himalayas, but it's all become a mythology, which means it's not real. But on the other hand, you also have some evidence for the fact that there is a lot of what we, what we're dealing with, we don't understand and we don't know about it. You know, in the sense that our world's problem, if you're looking at current civilization, dominant civilization, is that it tries to convince us that we know everything. And in fact, we are extremely ignorant about almost everything. We have just a few notions, some of which are probably real and others are speculative. And we think that this is all, real knowledge and we know everything. Every civilization had this belief that they had mastered the secrets of the universe. And in fact, by definition, the secrets of the universe are unfathomable. But if you look at the case of Agartha and Shambhala, the two hidden kingdoms in Tibet or somewhere in Central Asia, then you know that there are other dimensions. Even science tells you today that there are different universes and they may be parallel, or they may be interrelated. And therefore, the reality that exists beyond day-to-day visible reality is not something that we can discard because we have actually physical proof that it is there. And that's why all civilizations have accepted the supernatural. We are the only one, I'm talking about the current modern civilization built in the West in the last 2 centuries. I mean, you can push it back to the 1600s. It's the only civilization which tells you, well, there is no supernatural because, we can see and understand everything, and science enables us to detect anything that exists. And if science hasn't found it, then it doesn't exist. But then, of course, this is a great delusion or illusion because by definition, there are lots of things that we know exist and we can't understand how they function. We cannot fit them into our current so-called scientific concept of reality. And one of the most obvious one is the case of the so-called UFOs, the so-called extraterrestrials, interplanetaries. They are obviously beings that are far above us. And the interesting part is that they switch from what we call the material world into another world, which is not material, at least not in the sense that we understand matter. And yet they switch back to us, and when they are with us, they leave material traces. I mean, their craft are real craft. They fly, they land, and those people land, and they come into contact with human beings. And yet they can also disappear. Now, this is something which ancient India and other civilizational states knew very well. They talk about it all the time. You take any of the great texts, even in Ashoka's edicts, you have a reference to those creatures who came flying down in Vimanas, and they are part of the world, of the universe. So this was very well accepted, but it's only been discarded in the last, let's say, 300 years under the pressure of some rationalist thinking. And now it's coming back, because if you look, just go to the US Congress hearings on UAPs, so-called UAPs, which are unidentified aerial phenomena, which we used to call UFOs, and you see that there is huge amount of evidence about very advanced living beings who are coming and going and who very often interfere with our affairs, and they can modify the world in many ways. I think if you look at artificial intelligence, it is also an effect of our interaction with some higher forms of intelligence, which is why we are not able to control it.
You also mentioned the Agartha holds a great power treasure, and in Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, and Hinduism, the Mount Kailash is sacred for everyone. And you also mentioned that in Rama also, after his kingdom, he went there, and Pandavas also they went to the mountains region. So do you think in Hinduism and monks, they go and in Himalayas and do meditation and all those things. So do you think this regions, Himalayan region, can we say that this is the Agartha, the lost kingdom we are talking about?
It's highly possible because there are plenty of reports, very credible reports of so-called supernatural events and supernatural phenomena. And there is a very long tradition related to that, which you find in Tibetan texts, which you find in Indian texts. So without going into it's a interdimensional aspect to the history of the Himalayas, which has influenced Indian civilization forever, for as long as we can tell. Even the history of Tibetans, the history of Tibet tells you that, there was a race of monkeys inhabiting the highlands, and then a particular deity or a group of deities came down from the skies and actually genetically modified them and created the modern Tibetans. Now, this is something which even His Holiness the Dalai Lama has quoted. So it shows you that there are references and probably memories of superhuman or supernatural interventions to create the human race, which is, by the way, what we are hearing now very often from testimonies. And now it's being taken up at the highest levels. I mean, it's being taken up at the Pentagon. Of course, they knew about it for a long time, but they didn't talk about it. Now, because of the US Congress and because of the desire by many politicians to know more about it, it's becoming obvious that our human species was not naturally emergent. It was probably modified and created. And we carry not only a soul, but we carry a genetic code, and the genetic code is what matters. That's why we are often called carriers, because the carrier is the vehicle, the vahana, that carries the genetic code, which is the reason for our identity and also the key to our immortality, because the genetic code is technically immortal, so it is the signature of an identity which is there forever, but which is not it's independent, but it's not a disconnected identity. It is part of the larger identity. It's like the bee within a hive, the bee is part of the hive, and so are we.
That's good. So there was an Arab 12th century scholar. His name was Qadi Said al-Andalusi. So he said the India was the first nation to have cultivated science, and he lauded the ability. But when we come to the today's reality, so people think in West also, people think that India got independence after when it got independence. So the Indian civilization started from that 1947, not before that. But when we go to the Vedas and all those things, there we find science, we find planes, designs, and all the advanced medical things. So what is the reason behind that today's generation or the West thinks that Indian civilization is all about Hinduism, which is about religion?
Well, I think that's a very primitive and superficial view, so it did not be taken very seriously. People who don't know anything about something may make any kind of statement. It doesn't necessarily have value. I can tell you that until the 18th century, at least, Western scholars were highly respectful of India's knowledge, whether they were religious or laymen. For example, the Jesuits did a lot of studies of Indian mathematics and Indian sciences, and they were very, very impressed, and they felt India had a lot to teach, even though India was pagan. So they had to somehow reconcile the view that Indians are not believing in the true religion because they are not Christian, but at the same time, they have gone so far in certain disciplines. And many of them try to explain it by saying, yes, but they got the science of the devil, which was a way that Christianity would qualify anything that somehow did not come from Christian knowledge, Christian tradition. So as a result, what you have from the 18th century is a very strong denigration of Indian culture, which accentuated in the 19th century because at that time you had the so-called Enlightenment in the West. And Enlightenment was essentially rationalistic, and it decided to discard most of the knowledge, not only in the rest of the world, but also even the ancient knowledge of Europe was considered primitive and inefficient and mistaken. And therefore, you have people like James Mill, John Stuart Mill's father, or you have people like Macaulay, the famous Macaulay, who says anything we do in Europe is so far superior to whatever the Indians have done over the centuries, in one way or another, because they have a primitive empirical knowledge, which is mixed with a lot of superstition and witchcraft, and we have the real science-based knowledge, supported by the true religion, Christianity. That goes without saying. So as a result, you have this very strong prejudice against Indian culture, civilization, and science, which has endured till our days. Why? Because it was convenient to the colonizers, saying, but you see, we brought them the railways. They didn't have railways. They didn't have highways. Then they didn't have cars. Motor cars. So, they didn't have any of those good things like electricity. And of course, sometimes some Indians have been trying to fight that by saying, no, but we had a lot of those things. And, some of that is awkward and unnecessary. You can't say that India was electrified because it's not true. But then the question is that Indian civilization had been based on a different principle. And let's face it, all civilizations have moments of great creativity and progress, and they have moments of stagnation or even moments of retrograde motion. So when that happens, a civilization can get stuck in its particular concepts and views, and it doesn't necessarily move forward, and other civilizations catch up and go ahead. So the West developed some very useful devices like railways, and India didn't have them, so the West could take pride in saying, we brought this to you, just as we brought you Christianity, if you want to take it. So that is all a game of power. And clearly, it gave the West a big advantage, the Europeans a very big advantage, because they were able to muster force to subjugate other civilizations, including the Indian civilization, the Chinese civilization, even the Japanese, pretty much all of them, right? So that's something which we can interpret as a philosophical phenomenon, which is guided by some factors such as demography, such as the evolution of intellectual development. For example, India in the Middle Age fell prey to a lot of internal fights particularly between Muslims and Hindus. Of course, Hindu kingdoms had been also fighting among themselves. Yeah. You cannot deny that. But the Muslims brought an additional dimension, which was basically a civilizational conquest, which the Hindus had never practiced among themselves because they shared broadly the same civilization. Therefore, when India fell into that situation for a few centuries, when dynasties of sultans succeeded each other and fought Hindu kingdoms, and at that point, the West had a big advantage because the West was able to send powerfully equipped fleets and soldiers to play on the divisions and gradually conquer India. But, there are other times when other civilizations that were not Europeans also conquered other places. So it's not unique to Europe. It happened at different times for different peoples. I mean, there was a time when the Romans conquered a lot, the Persians conquered a lot. You can see almost any part of the world and see that there are times of conquest and times of decline. And when a civilization conquers peacefully or not, you can see that it's in a stage of expansion. And then there is a time when that civilization freezes and starts eventually being conquered, which is what's happening to Europe right now. When Europe is gradually being conquered by outside invaders, if you call them that way, or immigrants.
That's wonderful. So when we talk about Indian civilization, so you mentioned here in the book that there was the four major civilization families share a similar stage to the Indian civilization, which is like Afro-Euro-Asiatic or Semitic, the Indo-Aryans. So in India, the people say that the Aryans were the outsider invaders who invaded the Indian civilization, but in West they say that Aryans were the Indians. So how do you differentiate in this thing?
This topic is so broad and so controversial that we could be talking about it for days. But without going into too many details, I would simply say that the Aryan concept is an 18th century concept, mostly brought about by German philologists and historians, and who were strongly driven to challenge the concept of a dominant Roman Latin civilization for Europe, because they had not been part of it as such. They were on the outside of it. So they said, we have an alternative, which is a great German civilization, which they called Aryan. Why? Because they were philologists. They knew about Sanskrit. They had seen the connections between Sanskrit and Old German, as well as other Germanic languages and Anglo-Saxon languages. And so they proposed that this was a common civilization, and that perhaps, according to what the Romans believe at some point, the Indians had civilized Germany. However, that concept, which was the original one, which was the original idea of Indo-Aryans, that's why we say Indo before we say Aryan, and we say Indo-Europeans, because now Indo-Aryan has got a bad name after Hitler. So we say Indo-Europeans. We don't put the Europeans first, because we can see that the Sanskrit texts are older than the oldest European texts. So there is a sense that India must have been first. However, with the advent of colonialism, of European colonialism, there was a very strong push to put Europe at the center of everything. And because Europe was the master, So naturally, the idea was we must have been at the source of the Aryan civilization. And possibly the Aryan civilization was born somewhere in the Caucasus, or in what is today Western Russia, or maybe in what is Scandinavia now. And therefore, this is where everything comes from. And the Indians were also colonized by those people, whoever they are. And obviously, this was new, because before that, since the European culture was Bible-centric, it was focused on the Bible, it believed that human beings had originated in the Near East, in what is today Iraq, and that they had spread east and west, and north and south. Therefore, the idea was that Indians must have also come from the Middle East, and the Indian civilization in particular. So they tried to connect the Indian civilization with the biblical civilization. For example, when the Indus Valley was discovered, the Indus Valley civilization, which we now call the Saraswati Hindu civilization, the idea was from archaeologists that this must be some Mesopotamian settlement, that came from Iraq and Syria. Then they found this is not really right. It is quite independent. And definitely it is not a Semitic culture. Therefore, we had to discard that notion. But the 19th century concept is still there, that somehow the Aryans came from somewhere. And they must have come from Eastern Europe or someplace like that, or maybe what is now Turkey. And so, as you know now, this is being very strongly challenged by Indian historians, and even by some Western historians and anthropologists, who say that there is strong evidence that India was perhaps the cradle, if you include Afghanistan, of course, Pakistan, and even Iran. And you can say that in that region of northwestern India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, eastern Iran, Khorasan, and Central Asia, that is the cradle of what is known as the Indo-European civilization. That seems the most reasonable assumption. People will keep arguing about it for centuries, because everybody has got their theory, and they try to prove that the other guy is wrong and that they know better. But actually, there is no convincing alternative to that particular theory. So you don't have to believe it, but you cannot reject it.
You cannot change the facts.
No, you cannot change the facts. And if you look, for example, at so-called Central Asian, Aryan or Indo-European settlements, you see, whether in Afghanistan or in Turkmenistan, in Uzbekistan, you can rather understand that those people are Vedic people, were Vedic people, and they did not necessarily originate there. They may very well have come from what is today India. If you look at Panini's Ashtadhyayi, you realize that it's Panini's, the Panini text. It says that, he talks about the Yavanas, and there are reasons to believe that the culture that he belonged to and the Sanskrit that he taught was actually the Sanskrit spoken in what is now Khorasan, which included Pakistan, Afghanistan, and even Punjab. And that's why even today, when Arabs or Muslims speak about India, they say Khorasan. So that is a region where you can see most probably the cradle of what we call classical Paninian Sanskrit. And that in itself shows that there was a certain unified or at least culturally homogeneous region.
So, in your first chapter, you mentioned Colonel James and Louis Jacolian. So there is an Todd's Annal and Antiquity of Rajasthan. So both men saw in India the mother or at least a blood sister of ancient Europe, and they sought to support that belief with profuse, it often disputed research. Can you tell us a little about this thing? What are you talking about?
Well, Colonel James Todd is a well-known historian of Rajasthan because he was a guest of the Maharanas of Udaipur. And as an English representative of in the East India Company, first he acquired remarkable knowledge of the history and the culture of Rajasthan. He was probably the first Western anthropologist in that region. And he also had enormous respect for the Rajputs and admiration for the Rajputs. And on the other hand, they reciprocated because he had essentially contributed to freeing them from the hold of the Marathas, who, as you know, were could be quite exploitive. When they took over these kingdoms, they basically took all the revenues and to finance their own empire. So the Rajput kings, in a way, were saved in their little kingdoms by the British when they came and sort of gave them protection. So that's the history of Colonel Todd, and I think his book, Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan, is quite remarkable because it goes into great length, revealing a lot of facts which have not even been studied further or which have been forgotten. And most people do not, I find many people don't even know about it or don't bother to read it because somehow some modern historians decided he wasn't historical enough, he wasn't accurate enough, because he was convinced that there was a commonality of cultures between a number of the people described in Rajasthan and Gujarat and those that we find in Europe. For example, he saw a connection between the Jats and the Utes of Denmark. And of course, now people say, well, that's far-fetched, because the Utes are a Nordic people, and how can you compare them to the Jats? But actually, it could very well be a population strand that migrated, because you have the same about the Saxons. The Saxons who conquered most of Germany and then went to England and became the Anglo-Saxons. They are the Shakas. And as you know, the Shaka era is one of India's classical chronological eras.
You also mentioned here, in Rig Vedic, it is mentioned that let us make the whole world Aryan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because Arya is nobility and culture. Therefore, if you learn the Aryan culture and if you develop the Brahminical sciences, then you become Arya. And that in itself is what the Vedas say, that, let's make the world Arya, because Aryas aren't cultured people, and they are it doesn't mean that they are a separate race, but it simply means that they are not participating in that culture. And as you know, culture in its Vedic sense was very powerful because it took over a lot of Southeast Asia and even East Asia, all the way to China, Korea, and Japan. And kings and the aristocracy, in particular, were very proud to learn and live by certain Vedic, Aryan, Sanskritic concepts and guidelines, right? So that's something which even till the 19th century, the end of the Chinese Empire, the Manchu Empire, the Manchu emperors, when they ascended the throne, they went through some very elaborate tantric rituals, which were practiced, which were actually officiated by Tibetan and Mongol lamas. So that was all part of the tantric Buddhist culture of India.
Okay. India is divided into two categories: North Indians, which we call Aryans, and the South Indians were Dravids. So, do you think the both are the part of the same trees of the same civilization, or do you think the Dravidians are the real ones and the Aryans who invaded India? Because nowadays both Dravidians say that North Indians are Aryan and the invaders, and the hate is going on. So, what's your thought on this thing?
That's another very touchy subject because politics is involved in it and religion as well and a lot of other factors. Definitely, there is a South Indian community, cultural and ethnic community, which you might call Dravidian, and which is particularly represented in Tamil Nadu, but there is a great deal of mixture between North and South, and therefore you cannot talk about a pure race on either side. Now, if you look at Brahmins, for example, who in South India have played such a great role, it's a common knowledge and it's very publicly admitted that many of them migrated from other parts of India. But you have a lot of Brahmins who also are of mixed origin and who essentially became Brahmins because of their functions and because they went through the process of Brahminization. And therefore, remember that in the 17th century, even the Jesuits tried to become Brahmins in order to be better accepted, because they thought that unless they learned from Brahmins and became like Brahmins, Indians would not listen to them, right? Because Brahmins had the real knowledge. So that was an attempt which shows that other communities did the same. And obviously, if you look at certain particular Brahmin communities like the Saraswats or you can name several of them, they may have different origins, right? They may come from other countries and they may have been absorbed and become part of the overall Brahminical culture. Now, in the South, for political reasons and economic reasons, there was a sort of a rebellion or a movement of dissent and denigration of Brahmins, right? And clearly some of the middle classes in the so-called Tamil or other communities, they took this opportunity to say that we don't want Brahmins because they are foreigners and exploiters. And that was also with a view to benefiting from their own social upliftment, right? So Brahmins in some way were condemned by certain movements and which had a strong connection to Christian missionaries. And so you can see there was also a political agenda there. The fact remains that South Indian culture cannot be differentiated from the Brahmins, and some of the rishis of the Vedic era came from the South. And also the fact that you have the Sangam era, the three Sangam eras in Tamil Nadu, shows you that there was definitely a very strong, very ancient in South Indian civilization, but that it very early on became gradually mixed or mingled with the northern or central Indian civilization, and you cannot separate the two. I mean, how can you have South Indian culture, in particular Tamil culture, which tends to be the most particularist? How can you even think of it without Sanskrit, without the Vedic text, without the practices in the temples? I mean, there is hardly anything left if you remove that, because we all know that Sanskrit was a very assimilative language, and so was the Sanskrit culture. So it took elements from all the communities of India, or at least from many of them, those that are called tribes, which is another very disputable definition, because why the British said, oh, tribes, because they compared them to the African tribes. But if you look at the jati concept in India, then the tribes were just jatis, and they are not necessarily non-Indian. They just had a separate lifestyle because they lived in nature and they had specific occupations. But you cannot say that, they were somehow not part of the of course, they may not have been part of the Chaturvarna system, because the Chaturvarna system was very much based on a certain political order, right? And a certain liturgical order. But still, they were part of the Jati system, right?
Wonderful. So, in today's, there are different religions, but every religion have very similarities. Just like in Hinduism, you shave your head. In Buddhism, also same thing, and in Islam, same thing. And you mentioned here that I think in Bible there is mentioned that diversity of mankind must vanish into the primeval unity in the final process of the return to the truth of the source. This same thing is also mentioned in the Vedas, that Shiva will destroy the world and the whole world will start from the Satyuga. So what's your thought on this thing?
Well, Indian civilization from the earliest times we know has been based on the cyclical process, right? So whenever anything exists, it goes through a cycle, the seasonal cycle or the life cycle, childhood, youth, middle age, maturity, and then old age and death. So the same happens to civilization, the same happens to planets, to solar systems, to galaxies, to the entire universe. even the universe vanishes and is replaced by a new universe, which may or may not be identical to the one that has disappeared. So the same can be said in the context of Indian civilization and also global civilization, because contrary to the Western civilization, which has tended to limit the scope of time because of the concept of the Messiah and salvation. You see, which means that the world is born at a particular time, then a Messiah comes to save it, and that can only happen once. And then eventually the world vanishes, and those who have been virtuous are saved, and they go to paradise, and the others go to hell. And then nobody knows what happens later. It's supposed to be the end of everything. Now, in India, there was always, or at least as far as we know, the concept was always that there is a series of returns. Cycles go on and on. And that's what Nietzsche called the eternal return in Western philosophy. So that is something which we now are coming to understand better, because science tells us that since nothing is created and nothing is destroyed, matter inevitably returns to a state that it has already experienced before. So once you get to what we consider to be the possible disintegration of the universe, then there has to be a rebirth of the universe, which will be another universe. And just as there must have been another universe before ours, and now astronomers are even detecting, astrophysicists are detecting traces, possible traces of the previous universe, which has not been completely destroyed. It still exists as a sort of remaining powder or light, something which hasn't quite died yet. So that in itself gives a justification to the concept of eternal return and of the cyclical renewal.
Just like World War I happened and World War II happened, and the people say that in World War III the earth will be destroyed, and that's the same thing was mentioned in the Rigvedas like many centuries ago. So do you believe in that everything is written prehand?
You see, everything by definition exists outside space and time. That is something which physics now teaches us. And in particular, if you read David Bohm, one of the leading quantum physicists, he talked about two states of reality. One was what he called the explicate universe, which is everything that we see, feel, experience, are. That is all explicate. It's the thing that is outside, you might say, the womb. But then beneath it, if you go into something below, something called the Planck scale, you get into the implicate universe. And that is something which has no time, no space, and which is eternally present. Now, that's a very hard thing to understand for us, but it was very much prefigured by the various Hindu schools of thought, especially by Advaita Vedanta. Because if you read Vivekachudamani by Adi Shankaracharya, it shows you that there is a inner reality which is totally beyond space and time. And that is what many physicists today are talking about. Arkani Hamed, but perhaps the first one was John Wheeler. He wasn't the first, but he did a lot of work on that from Princeton. And so, that notion has become quite widespread now in certain scientific circles, that you are dealing with a reality which is beyond time, space, matter, energy. And therefore, if you take that realization to its core, then you realize that there is a, likelihood of cyclic destruction that's inevitable, because entropy is the defining factor of creation. Entropy means the gradual loss of energy, which in turn leads to eventual annihilation or destruction. But that is a superficial phenomenon, because inner reality, what we call Parabrahman, or, we have given it many, many different names. It can be Parameshwara, or that is never destroyed. It never changes. It's completely, immutable.
Okay. When we talk about Middle Asia, so Middle Asia saw very powerful kingdoms like Mongolia, ruled, and then Ottoman, Chinese, and Turkish, and when we talk about Europe, French and British also. So do you think it's a coincidence that Middle Asia was very powerful?
Well, I mean, Middle Asia, I think most parts of the world were very powerful at one time or another. The only exception, perhaps, is between the so-called New World, which is the American continent, which was definitely had a different history because the communication was not frequent.
And Africa, some parts of Africa.
Yeah, but Africa was also deeply influenced, especially in the north and east. So, yeah, maybe you can make an exception for West Africa, but then again, even that is not clear because there is some evidence of Asians and even Europeans coming to what we call Black Africa, especially on the West Coast, quite a long time ago. We can't set a date, but it certainly predates even the Roman Empire. So this being said, I think that when you are looking at Central Asia, the fact is that from the late 19th century, there is a theory which was popularized by Halford Mackinder, a British historian and geographer. And Mackinder felt that Central Asia was the pivot of the world. And he actually found the actual heart of it, which was somewhere between, let's say, Chinese Turkestan, Mongolia, and the current Central Asian republics. And he said that this was the place where Asia could be, from which the whole of Asia could be controlled, because somehow it was a very relatively flat area with few mountain chains, so it could be easily people could easily move around it, and anybody who had the power to move troops could subjugate most of the surrounding kingdoms, which happened with Genghis Khan, and it may have happened earlier, and it happened again with Timur Tamerlane. So you have this connection between, China, Mongolia, Siberia, Iran, and of course India was a bit separate from that because of the Himalayas on one side and because people had to cross the Khyber Pass, which they did on several occasions, and come into northwestern India. But beyond that, there is that commonality which enabled the Genghis Khan and his successor to go all the way into Eastern Europe and even Central Europe, and which kept Russia as a culturally semi-Mongol empire. So that in itself shows you that the fears of the British and Americans about the possibility of a Eurasian Union challenging them is coming true because of the union between Russia, China, North Korea, and perhaps one day South Korea and Iran. At that point, and then India, which is a bit of an outlier, but still is drawn into that as well for economic and strategic reasons. So then you are looking at a possible unity of Eurasia, and Russia's leverage over Europe is very strong, because when Europe is not strong, Western Europe is not strong, then Russia can become a dominant power, which is why there is a huge fight about Ukraine right now, because the sense is that if Ukraine falls, then Russia will definitely have a very strong influence over the rest of Europe, which happened before. When Napoleon was defeated, Russia became almost the key of the European order, and it was only because of Britain that was using its money and its power and the Indian Empire to fight Russian influence, although they were technically allied, but they were still challenging each other. So you have that concept which has survived into the Great Game in the late 19th century, when the British and the Russians were fighting each other in Central Asia, and the British were afraid that Russia would try to get into India, which some Russians wanted to do. And of course, after independence, you see the new agreements between India and Russia, which in turn were very, very concerning for the West, especially the British and the Americans. And now this fight is continuing. Look at the latest news, what's happening with the meeting in Tianjin, and then, Trump threatening India, say, don't go there, because we're going to make you pay for it and all that.
When we talk about India and Russia's relations, so West thinks like our Foreign Minister Jaishankar said that West think that their problem is the world's problem, but world's problem is not their problem. And when there was, I think few days back, Finland president, I think he made a statement that if we don't engage with India, we may lose it. So what's your thought on this thing? Like Trump is putting sanctions on India, and we saw that in SCO meeting that Russia, China, and North Korea are like coming together. So do you think it is good for the West?
No, the fact that Asia is coming together is not good for the Western ruling system. Let's put it this way. The problem is that Europe now is not a master of its own destiny. It is under US control, which through British proxies also, which means that Europe cannot do what it wants, assuming that it wants something, because European elites are also quite lack vision, most of them. They are basically supported by the Americans, and so they are relying on the Americans. And the Americans do not want any kind of alliance or even economic relationship between Western Europe, NATO powers, and the East, Russia, China. They are trying to prevent that because they know that this would leave America isolated and weakened. Therefore, to keep a central position and a controlling position in the world, America needs to keep Europe under its control. And it is not obviously pleased whenever Europe tries to establish any kind of economic and political relations with the East. So what Trump is trying to do, because America is in a very, very bad situation, America is bankrupt, basically. So Trump is trying to restore American industry, which has been destroyed in the last 30, 40 years, except for some very high tech. But even the high tech is highly dependent on Taiwan, South Korea, Japan,
China also.
and China as well. So as a result of which, Trump is now trying to fight all the countries that refuse to accept American supremacy. For example, he's going after the massive reserves of capital accumulated in Asia, saying that you need to consider this like a sovereign wealth fund that America will use for its own development and reindustrialization. Now, why would other countries contribute to that? Well, because America says we have the biggest armies, and if you don't do what we tell you, then we will not only use economic weapons, but we will also possibly attack you militarily. So you better watch out. So this is a typical recourse of a power which is no longer able to prevail by its own economic strength. It needs to use military threats and pressure. And as a result, Europe is now in a very difficult situation because they have been deprived of the ability to finance and fuel their economies with Asian resources, and particularly Russian natural resources. So they have to rely on America to supply them with very expensive shale gas and liquefied natural gas. And as a result of which, the European economy is declining very sharply. And on the other hand, they are also invaded by large amounts of population from the Middle East and Africa. And so there is this decline of Europe, which in a way America is supporting, because they feel that if Europe is weak, that's one competitor less, So where that goes, we don't know, because nowadays there is also a new trend in America, which is represented by Elon Musk, saying that we must save Europe, so we must give Europe the means to fight immigration, and we must support so-called far-right parties, which was not the American policy until now. The Americans were very much in favor of Europe having the so-called liberal left parties that were letting in a lot of immigrants and basically reducing Europe's power, both economically and militarily. Now the idea is that we must rearm Europe, because otherwise they'll be taken over by our enemies, and then we'll have to deal with some very unfriendly European nations. But on the other hand, they certainly want to keep Europe away from Russia and China as much as they can.
Like when we talk about like civilization, like Egyptian, Mayans, and all those civilizations, they declined when they were at its peak. And nowadays we see like America and Russia's, when Britain was also like the power, superpower, and the French was also superpower. So do you think this idea of like great Israel, great Britain, great America, and in India we also see Vishwaguru, we want to make India like superpower. So do you think it is the reason behind the declination of any civilization? Can we include this region? Because they were at peak. For example, Egyptian were like at its peak, but unfortunately they declined.
I think there are different reasons for every decline. I mean, if you read the latest book by William Dalrymple, The Golden Road, which is quite a remarkable book. It shows why and how Indian civilization reached its economic peak and then declined, and likewise other civilizations declined because of a number of factors. For example, in the case of India, it's you can attribute it to the fact that there was a growth of the Arab commercial strength from the advent of Islam, especially, which in a way cut off a lot of the European trade from India, and therefore India had to turn its energy toward the east. That's one explanation. But if you look at Egypt, there are also geographic causes. Egypt depended on a single river, and other than that, it was surrounded by desert. So it was like a sort of a corridor civilization. And once certain empires became powerful, such as the Greek Empire, the Persian Empire, which conquered Egypt, then the Egyptians were no longer an independent state, they were a colony, or at least they were the province of an empire. Then came the Greeks, then came the Romans, and then came the Arabs. So eventually Egypt lost its autonomy and its political independence, and therefore it lost much of its culture as well. India experienced a similar process once the Turks and the Afghans and the Turks started coming in, and then the Persians, and then the others. But at the same time, India was big and strong enough that it was able to protect its civilization very largely. Of course, there was also a process of decadence in many ways, because a lot of the ancient knowledge became frozen. It was no longer understood in its applications. It became more like a sort of a legacy. Yeah, we have this, and we don't quite know what it says, but we admire it. So that created a situation in which the British could easily impose their power and convince many Indians that their knowledge, their education were superior, that they had something to teach that Indians didn't have. So that shows that there are many ways in which you can conquer a civilization. First, by telling them that what you are doing is not good enough, we are much better. If you look at the American civilization, if you call it that way, it's a derivative of European civilization, particularly Anglo-Saxon, and it's still very primitive. I mean, let's face it. Individually, Americans have achieved great things because they have remarkable thinkers. By the way, many of the top ones were inspired by India, either because they came to America and spread things, or because they were native to America. You can talk of Emerson, you can talk of Walter Russell, you can talk of Nikola Tesla, and more recently there is Isaac Bentov and Andrija Puharic. All those people spread a lot of Indian philosophical and scientific ideas about the nature of the being, of intelligence, of consciousness, about the way in which the world works, about the forces that are behind nature and existence. All those things influence America in some ways. This is what I say in my other book, the book about basically the occult part of American history and reality. But other than that, the average civilization of America as a public presentation is very primitive. It's all about people making money and trying to be as free as possible and paying as low taxes as possible. And, there is nothing there but basically enjoyment of material goods, right? And trying to be as free as possible from any kind of control. And I think there is always a symbol in history, and Trump is a symbol of that. He's the absolute materialist. He has no notion of anything but money and power, and all he talks about is dollars. And for him, this is a typical thing that there is nothing else than money, basically. And if you have money, then you are powerful. Then people have to submit to you. And if you don't have money, then you are a loser, and you don't count, which is unfortunately the basis of American political philosophy. Right. And so you can say it's an Asuric notion, it's because Asuras are also powerful people and they can do good things, but they think material goods are the only thing that matters, basically. They do not understand the hidden side of things.
Side effects of Maya.
Yeah, exactly.
So you also mentioned here in especially France, Germany, Russia, India, and Iran to the south of Asia, and China to the east are the key players in terms of geography, culture, influence, and economic importance. So if those 6 countries can achieve meaningful cooperation between them, there is every reason to believe that many other nations will gradually join this Commonwealth. So do you think it will happen in the future soon, like all these 6 powers will come together and we can see like a peaceful world anytime soon?
I think the peaceful world is a never land because there is a certain law of nature that makes strife part of it. It's like night and day. It's a cycle. You cannot have existence without strife, just as you cannot have strife without moments of peace. But this being said, I think that partly because of the situation in America and in the rest of the world, you can see already a convergence of nations that would be otherwise either estranged or even inimical, such as Russia, China, Korea, Iran, and even India, coming together because they have to, due to economic compulsions, beast, and it needs to fight to try to regain the power it has lost. And therefore, it will be aggressive and exploitive towards any country that it feels it can pressure. And that's what exactly what America is doing with all those countries, including its so-called allies in Europe and South America, but particularly towards China, Russia, India. So I think as a result, there is that reunion taking place. But of course, I mentioned 2 European countries which are not there because they are under American influence, and they cannot really move very far from that. They are stuck in the NATO EU American-dominated circle, and they don't have an independent foreign policy. But this being said, I know that there is a lot of churning in Europe, intellectual churning, and many countries feel that we should move away from this Atlantic-dominated world, Atlantic-centric world, and ally or at least associate with the rising powers. And some countries in Europe are already doing that, like smaller countries like, particularly Hungary, Slovakia. They are almost leaving the European Union and trying to join BRICS and other such associations, of course, Belarus did, and like Ukraine may one day, not too far into the future. So this is definitely happening, but it will take some time. And meanwhile, we may have to face a much bigger war than what we're experiencing now, because this war is already started in Ukraine and in the Middle East between Israel and the other states in the region. And it shows again the clash between the American-dominated sphere and the nations or the powers that are rising against it and challenging it.
In Asia, we are seeing like 2 superpowers are like growing, China and India. So do you think they can, in future, they will be like the American and the Russian rivals? Like they will be like the scenarios we see in nowadays, well, in America and the Russia?
Yeah, to the extent that America and Russia are both enemies, and somehow they have also collaborated, and even today there is an attempt to collaborate, if only because Americans would like to detach Russia from China and say, why don't you join us? But on the other hand, if you join us, then you have to submit to our will, because we are also tied to the Europeans and we wouldn't like you to take over Ukraine because that makes you too powerful. Therefore, the Russians may not want to join the Americans because you cannot trust the Americans. They change every time the president changes, and even the same president can do very different things within 4 years. So basically, the Russians are going to keep their balance, not going all the way with China, but certainly protecting themselves from the West, which means the US primarily. And I think India is doing the same thing. India is also saying we can be friends with America, but not at any cost. And we're not going to become enemies with China because you want us to, which is naturally what the Americans would like. And now when they see India is not playing their game, then they are interested in rebuilding Pakistan, because they feel just like Ukraine was used against Russia, Pakistan can be used to put pressure on India in so many ways.
So P.N. Mukherjee said that India has to deal with governments as they exist, and we are not interested in exporting our own ideology. We are a democracy and we would like democracy to be flourish everywhere, but this is for every country to decide for itself. Just like Jaishankar said that India's needs are cannot be forced by others. Just like India needs oil. Means when the Americans put the sanctions on the India to buy the Iranian oils, then India went to the Russia for the discount oil. But Americans and West saying that India is fueling the Ukraine war, like it is supporting the Russia. And Trump said that Ukrainian war is not Russian war, it is Modi's war. So what's your thought on this thing?
No, I think this is just not to be taken seriously. I mean, this is just rather silly, gesturing to try to make India somehow obey the instructions by saying you are funding Russia. Of course, the reason is that Russian oil is cheap, so it's undercutting not only the American oil, which is expensive, but it's also undercutting even Saudi Arabian oil. So naturally, a lot of countries are upset because they cannot raise oil prices, and therefore they are blaming India because they would like to essentially take Russian oil off the market, which again is an American idea because the Europeans cannot really do without it. You know, they are buying more Russian oil and gas than ever. So Europe is not really, even though they claim now we don't want any, but actually they are taking it. They are just taking it through other sources. But the Americans would like to pressure India, Russia, and Europe at the same time. So, you know, you can imagine it's a geopolitical game. And the fact is that technically a lot of the oil is sold and bought. Nobody knows who is actually producing it. You know, it's on high seas in tankers, and it's a day-to-day market. You just buy the oil at a tanker, and you don't really know, or you don't even ask where the oil comes from, except you have a specific type of oil that corresponds to your needs. But other than that, it's the idea of saying, you know, you must cut off Russian oil is just for a political and economic pressure. And it's tried to put India in a corner and say you must also leave BRICS because we don't like BRICS, and you must make sure you only trade in the dollar because we need the dollar to remain the reserve currency. I mean, it's pure imposition of their particular economic interests, saying you dare not go against us because we will hurt you. You know, that's all it is.
So in current time, like Asian group and BRICS and SCOs are like the growing organizations, and these doesn't include Europe and the America great powers like we see in United Nations. So do you think like Europe should focus on these BRICS nations and all Asian nations and should cooperate with Asia rather than America? Because we can say that America is not a trusted partner. He cannot be your friend. So do you think it's the time for the Europe to focus on, to engage with China, Russia and India more?
Well, as I said before, many Europeans think so, but it's not easy because America holds the veto power in Europe. And at this point, politicians in Europe are mostly obliged to follow the American instructions. So, because they owe their power and their survival to American acceptance. So they are not going to go this way. They may make some moves to try to improve their relations with India or even with China because they need the Chinese goods and they also need the Chinese market for their products. But on the one hand, they are very worried that China is gradually eviscerating Western economies because China is replacing most of what they make with their own products. You see, it's a very long-term game. If you look, for example, at the very critical markets like high-speed trains or commercial planes, you see that both China and Russia are building their own now. So what will happen then to Boeing and Airbus? You know, they'll compete, but then they may not succeed because some of the technologies and also the pricing will be advantageous or at least competitive. So they may lose a big part of their market. In fact, Boeing surely will because they are having lots of technical problems. So then you can imagine America losing many of its crown jewels, which are already very depleted. And therefore, it's become vital for them to try to stop that. But then how do they stop it, you know? They either have to become competitive, which means they have to reduce the living standards. And this is what Trump is trying to do. He will make the dollar much lower, much cheaper. And he will obviously reduce the living standards of people, but he will try to make them more competitive in what they produce, because with a strong dollar, American goods are not competitive. You know, so you have the game here. What do you want to do? Do you want to keep yourself as a sort of high-income country when you don't really have production to justify that. Or if you want to become a producing country again, then you have to somehow bring everybody down, because the Chinese live with much less money than the Americans. Therefore, the Americans basically have to go down to the level of the Chinese or even the Indians, So that's not easy. Any country that has become rich, people won't accept to go down. Americans can, on the one hand, you have lots of very poor Americans, maybe 15, 20%. But on the other hand, any Americans who have a job, they want $20, $30 an hour, that sort of thing, which makes them very uncompetitive.
So when we talk about China, China is like growing rapidly, and it's because of its science and technology. So do you think the transformation of human reality is caused by science and technology?
Certainly, because science and technology reflects obviously the greater understanding of the laws of nature and how to use them to our benefit. But you are also looking at science and technology, which is a process that is fed from outside sources, in the sense that, the latest industrial revolution that we have experienced in the last, say, 40, 50 years, it originally came from a number of phenomena that took place in various parts of the world. And it led us to understand a lot of new technologies and also discover new materials. And this is what is now called, the science of metamaterials, and many other things which have become more or less public knowledge, in the sense that first they went into military technologies, and then from the military they went into the civilian sector. And that's how you had these huge companies such as Google and Microsoft and many others that emerged out of certain technologies which had been sort of put into the private domain by primarily the US military industrial complex. So that's why many of those companies that are supposed to be private are in fact not so private, because the US government has a critical role in them, And in fact now Trump feels that some of those companies should be more integrated into the government. The government should have more direct shareholding. That's what he's doing with NVIDIA, and he's also doing it now. He wants to do it with Lockheed Martin, which is one of the key troves of restricted technologies. So, you have a sort of a renationalization of American industry, which is taking place.
When we talk about technology and science, I think a few days back, Trump said that the American company should not buy other like Indians or any Chinese workers. So do you think it is a very good idea to only hire your own nationality and not others?
Well, technically, of course, this is considered, or this could be called part of mercantilism, which is that you want to have your own people, make everything, sell everything, and you don't buy much from anywhere. And therefore, you are becoming very rich because everybody has to buy what you produce, and you don't really buy what others produce, so you don't spend the money. Because, Trump has this bee in his bonnet that any money that we pay for something, it's like giving money away. So it's still our money. We shouldn't give it. We shouldn't buy anything. We should just produce and sell. But this is a mercantilist perspective, but it's only practical if you have a much higher level of technology and if you have a very good workforce, and others don't. But if you are dealing with countries that have a very good workforce, like China, like Russia, like in certain things India, like Brazil, and not to mention Europe, then you are losing your ability to compete with them, not to mention dominate them. And therefore, how do you do that? I mean, you have to have a hardworking, well-educated workforce, and America doesn't really have that, if you look at their attempt to move the semiconductor industry from Taiwan to US, that's a very difficult thing to do, because Taiwan has got a very good, precise workforce. They have very high levels of education, and they have all the right ingredients to do what they are doing, TSMC. But if you move it to America, especially to Arizona, which has no water when semiconductor technology needs lots of water, and then you have American workers, who are not very good, and they don't really want to work very hard. They want to have plenty of vacations. They will, So then how do you get these workers? If you import the Taiwanese, then you are not doing it with Americans again. You are doing it with foreign workers. So now Trump is trying to get rid of a lot of foreign workers because he feels that Americans should get all the jobs. But then Americans, in many cases, are not able to do it because they have a relatively small percentage of very highly trained engineers and scientists, but the rest of the country is rather uneducated and they are undisciplined. You know, they are into doing their own thing and smoking pot and, you know, so you can't really generate something like that. It takes a generation, and Trump doesn't have a generation. He's trying to do it in 4 years.
Okay. Do you think it is likely to play a new its role as a world teacher, both in terms of ancient spiritual discipline and a new knowledge-based technologies?
Definitely, India has the ability to do that, but it needs to improve and in some ways change its educational system because, as we all know, the educational system was largely based on Western, particularly British models, and it largely ignored a lot of the Indian traditional knowledge. It was considered antiquated and backward, and the only recourse was supposed to be Western technology. And of course, a lot of that is now found not to be valid anymore, and it has to go with a particular kind of organization which India traditionally does not have. So it's not easy to adapt certain things to the Indian environment, which is why India has also remained very dependent on foreign technology acquisition. It hasn't developed many of its own. And therefore, Indians tend to be reluctant to indulge in, you know, cutting-edge research. They prefer to rely on something else from outside and then buy it or in some way indigenize it. But that is not sufficient to win mastery of certain fields. So I think there is a whole transition which the government has understood because Narendra Modi has been speaking continuously about Atmanirbhar and about Make in India and about Vikshit Bharat. And basically indigenizing technology and indigenizing education, a new education policy, NEP. All that is part of this transition, but it's very hard to do because you have a lot of people in India itself who are reluctant to do that because they were trained in the West and they think that, you know, this is nonsense. How can you take Indian ancient knowledge and make it relevant? We should just follow whoever, the Japanese, the Americans. So that is a problem. And I think India needs to go through this transition because as long as so many people are just trained to become business managers or lawyers or, you know, go into these fields which are basically not producing any new thinking in terms of generating employment and in terms of making the country wealthier, then you are still dealing with many sectors of the economy that are essentially parasitic, you know, like chartered accountants, or I mean, in the sense that they are needed, but you cannot have an economy dominated by these interests, you know, legal or you have to have a very highly effective engineering and scientific inventive elite, which is something that is still, you know, work in the making.
I think that's where we come to the previous question. Like in India, we see we think that the India doesn't had any technology or this knowledge, but in reality, 5,000 years ago, in our Vedas it is written that in science and all those medical things, but it's about perception. Like we got independence from British, and that's where from Indian civilization started.
No, of course, I don't think anybody says Indian civilization started with the British, but it just says that India, this was a typical Nehruvian perspective. India has a wonderful culture, arts and all that, but when it comes to practical matters like creating a modern economy, then you need to rely on either the Western or the Soviet socialist example, which is a modification of the original Western capitalist perspective, and therefore you are basically stuck with these foreign models, and there was no real trust in the ancient Indian way of doing things. You know, of course, things have improved with a growing understanding of things like, you know, the Chanakya treaties, the Arthashastra, and in several others, and we know there are something like at least 8 or 10 million manuscripts in India today, which probably means that there is more than 1 million original text in many, many different disciplines, and most of them have never been studied, understood, or analyzed for their contents. There are very few exceptions, which have yielded very interesting results, even with regard to technology, such as chemistry, metallurgy, and all that. So that shows us there is a lot to be done in this area. It doesn't mean that you don't borrow and take from the West and all that, but you also have to develop your own models, because autonomy is fundamental. And you are never going to get full control of a foreign technology. You know, they are not going to give it to you. They will want to sell you things, and they say, don't try to see what's inside. You just use it, you know, and we'll tell you. And I mean, that's what Americans do. They sell you something, and they say, actually, we're renting it to you. And if we don't like the way you use it, we won't let you use it, you know. So that's not a way to acquire autonomy.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for joining us today, and wish you all the best for your upcoming projects.
Thank you, Wingme. Thank you.